The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Queen Camilla stepped out of her private car. Her cream-colored coat fluttered in the gentle breeze, and her pearl necklace caught the early light. Today was different from her usual royal duties. She had received word that there was a security concern that needed her immediate attention, and she was determined to handle it personally. As she walked toward the main entrance, her heels clicked against the ancient stones that had witnessed centuries of royal history. The palace guards stood at attention, their red uniforms pristine and their expressions stoic. These were the men and women who dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family. Yet Camilla felt a growing frustration with what she perceived as a lack of proper protocol. The issue had been brewing for weeks. Reports had reached her about guards who seemed too casual in their duties, laughing and chatting when they thought no one was watching. As someone who had worked hard to earn her place in the royal family, Camilla believed strongly in maintaining the dignity and tradition that the monarchy represented. She had spent years learning the proper ways, the correct procedures, and the importance of every detail in royal life. Standing before the main guard post, she noticed Sergeant James Morrison, a tall man in his early 30s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor. He had been serving the royal family for nearly 8 years, known among his colleagues for his dedication and his ability to remain calm under pressure. What Camilla didn't know was that James had recently received devastating news about his mother's terminal illness, and he had been struggling to balance his personal grief with his professional responsibilities. Camilla approached him with the authority she felt her position demanded. Her voice carried across the courtyard as she began to address what she saw as unacceptable behavior. The other guards nearby could sense the tension building, and several pedestrians and tourists beyond the palace gates began to take notice of the unusual scene unfolding. James listened quietly as Camilla expressed her concerns about the guards' conduct. His hands remained clasped behind his back in the traditional military position, and his eyes stayed focused straight ahead. However, those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of emotional strain that he was trying so hard to hide. His jaw was slightly tighter than usual, and there was a heaviness in his shoulders that spoke of burdens beyond his professional duties. The Queen Consort's words grew sharper as she continued, pointing out specific incidents that had been reported to her. She spoke about the importance of maintaining proper decorum at all times, regardless of personal circumstances. Her tone suggested that she expected immediate changes and complete compliance with royal protocol. The morning air seemed to grow thicker with each word, and the usual sounds of London traffic felt distant and muted. What Camilla couldn't see was the internal battle that James was fighting. Just 3 days earlier, he had received a phone call from his father, telling him that his mother's condition had worsened significantly. The doctors had given her only weeks to live, and James had been torn between his duty to the crown and his desire to spend precious time with his dying mother. He had requested leave, but due to security concerns and staffing shortages, his request had been denied. As Camilla continued her critique, other palace staff began to gather at windows and doorways, sensing that something significant was happening. The head of security, who had worked with James for years, watched from a distance with growing concern. He knew James's character better than anyone and understood the personal struggles the young sergeant was facing. The tourists and media representatives who had gathered outside the palace gates began taking photos and videos. Though they couldn't hear the exact words being exchanged, social media posts started appearing with speculation about what was happening, and news outlets began preparing stories about a potential confrontation at the palace. James remained silent throughout Camilla's speech, his training and respect for the institution preventing him from interrupting or defending himself. However, his silence only seemed to fuel Camilla's frustration. She interpreted his lack of response as disrespect or indifference, not realizing that he was simply following the protocol that required him to listen without interruption when being addressed by a member of the royal family. The moment stretched on, becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. The other guards maintained their positions but were clearly affected by what they were witnessing. Many of them had served alongside James and knew him to be one of the most dedicated and reliable members of their team. They also knew about his mother's condition and had been quietly covering for him when his grief threatened to overwhelm him. As Camilla reached the climax of her address, demanding an immediate response and commitment to change, Something shifted in the atmosphere. The weight of personal tragedy, professional duty, and public scrutiny had created a perfect storm that was about to produce an unexpected and powerful moment. James slowly raised his eyes to meet Camilla's gaze for the first time during the encounter. In that moment, the formal distance between royalty and servant seemed to dissolve, replaced by something much more human and real. The tourists continued taking photos, unaware that they were about to witness a moment that would challenge assumptions about duty, compassion, and the true meaning of service. The stage was set for a response that no one, least of all Queen Camilla, could have anticipated. The morning sun continued to shine down on the courtyard, but everything was about to change in ways that would touch the hearts of everyone present and eventually reach far beyond the palace walls. James Morrison's voice, when it finally came, was steady but carried an undercurrent of deep emotion that caught everyone off guard. He didn't speak loudly, but his words carried across the courtyard with a clarity that made even the distant tourists stop their chatter and strain to listen. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice respectful but filled with a pain that was impossible to hide. "I need to tell you something that might help you understand why things haven't been quite right lately." Camilla's expression shifted slightly, her authoritative stance wavering as she heard something in his tone that she hadn't expected. The other guards remained at attention, but their eyes reflected a mixture of pride and concern for their colleague, who was about to bare his soul in front of royalty and strangers alike. James took a deep breath, his hands still clasped behind his back in military precision. 3 weeks ago, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors have given her maybe a month to live. She's been asking for me every day, wondering why I can't come home to see her one last time. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, and Camilla felt her chest tighten as the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. The tourists who had been taking photos lowered their cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something deeply personal and profound. "I've served this family for 8 years," James continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've missed birthdays, holidays, and family gatherings because my duty came first. I've stood in the rain, the snow, and the blazing sun, proud to protect the people I serve. But right now my heart is breaking because I can't be with the woman who gave me life when she needs me most." Camilla's face began to change, the stern lines of authority softening as the full weight of his words settled in. She had expected defiance or excuses, not this raw honesty that cut straight to the heart of what it meant to serve something greater than yourself. James's eyes, still fixed on hers, began to fill with unshed tears. "Yesterday she called me and said she was proud of me for choosing duty over comfort. She told me that protecting the royal family was more important than sitting by her bedside. But Your Majesty, with all due respect, I'm not sure I can keep pretending that everything is normal when my world is falling apart." The head of security, watching from his position near the main entrance, felt a lump forming in his throat. He had known about James's situation but hadn't realized the full extent of his struggle. The young sergeant had never complained, never asked for special treatment, and had continued to perform his duties even while carrying this crushing burden. "I've tried to maintain protocol," James said, his voice beginning to crack with emotion. "I've tried to keep my personal life separate from my professional responsibilities. But when you see me laughing with my fellow guards, it's not because I don't take my job seriously. It's because they're the only family I have here, and their friendship is the only thing keeping me from completely falling apart." Camilla felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up her neck as she realized how completely she had misunderstood the situation. The laughter she had interpreted as unprofessional behavior was actually a group of colleagues supporting one of their own through an unimaginable crisis. "I requested leave to spend time with my mother," James continued, his military bearing never wavering despite the emotion in his voice. "The request was denied due to security concerns. I accepted that decision because I understand that duty comes first. But please don't mistake my grief for disrespect. And please don't think that a moment of human connection with my colleagues means I care any less about protecting you and your family." The courtyard had become completely silent except for James's voice and the distant sounds of London traffic. Even the ever-present photographers seemed to sense that they were witnessing something sacred, something that demanded respect rather than sensationalism. "My mother taught me about service," James said, his voice growing softer but more intense. "She taught me that real strength comes from caring for others even when it costs you everything. She worked 3 jobs to put me through school, and she never complained when I chose this career path that would take me away from her. She's dying alone in a hospital room right now, and she's still more worried about me than herself." Camilla felt tears beginning to form in her own eyes as the magnitude of her mistake became clear. This wasn't a story about unprofessional guards or declining standards. This was a story about human love, sacrifice, and the sometimes impossible balance between personal needs and public duty. "I'm sorry if my behavior hasn't met your expectations," James concluded, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying enormous dignity. "I'm doing my best to serve you with honor while my heart is breaking. If that's not good enough, then I accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." The silence that followed was profound and heavy with emotion. Camilla stood there, her earlier anger and frustration completely replaced by a deep sense of shame and admiration. She had come to deliver a lecture about duty and protocol, but instead she had received a masterclass in what real service actually meant. The transformation in Queen Camilla's face was visible to everyone watching. The stern mask of royal authority crumbled away, replaced by something much more human and vulnerable. Her hands, which had been gesturing with commanding authority just moments before, now hung at her sides as she struggled to process the enormity of what she had just heard. For several long seconds, she stood frozen, her mind racing through the implications of James's words. Every criticism she had voiced now seemed petty and cruel in light of his revelation. The reports of guards laughing and being too casual suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. They weren't signs of disrespect, but acts of compassion among colleagues supporting one of their own through an impossible situation. "James," she said finally, her voice barely audible and completely transformed from the commanding tone she had used just minutes earlier. The single word carried the weight of recognition, regret, and a dawning understanding that would change everything. The other guards watched in amazement as their queen consort took a step closer to James, her formal posture melting into something more natural and caring. The tourists and photographers, sensing that something extraordinary was happening, maintained their respectful silence while continuing to document what they instinctively knew was a moment of great significance. "I had no idea," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger but filled with genuine emotion. "I came here today thinking I was addressing a discipline problem, but instead I've discovered something that shames me deeply. You've been carrying this burden alone while continuing to serve with honor, and instead of receiving support, you've received criticism from me." James remained at attention, but his eyes showed surprise at the complete change in Camilla's demeanor. He had expected consequences for speaking so openly about his personal situation, not this unexpected display of understanding and compassion from someone he had only known as a distant figure of authority. "Your mother," Camilla said, stepping even closer and speaking with increasing urgency. "Tell me about her. What's her name? Where is she? How can we help?" The questions came quickly, born from a genuine desire to understand and assist rather than from royal curiosity. James blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting this line of inquiry from someone he had just essentially challenged in front of a crowd of onlookers. "Her name is Margaret Morrison, Your Majesty," James replied, his voice still formal but tinged with confusion at this unexpected turn. "She's at St. Mary's Hospital in Liverpool. She's been there for 2 weeks now, and the doctors say—" He paused, struggling with the words. "They say she doesn't have much time left." Camilla closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, those watching could see tears beginning to form. The weight of understanding what this young man had been enduring while maintaining his duties was almost overwhelming. She thought of her own children, her own family relationships, and what it would mean to be separated from a dying parent by duty and protocol. "And your request for leave was denied?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The head of security, still watching from his position, shifted uncomfortably, knowing that he would soon need to explain the decision-making process that had led to the situation. "Yes, Your Majesty," James confirmed. "There were concerns about security levels and staffing. I was told that my personal situation, while regrettable, couldn't take precedence over the safety requirements for the royal family." Camilla turned slightly to look at the head of security, her expression clearly indicating that there would be serious discussions about this policy very soon. But for now, her focus remained entirely on the young man standing before her, who had shown more courage and dignity in the past few minutes than many people display in a lifetime. "James," she said, Turning back to him with an expression of determination, "I want you to know that what you've just done, speaking honestly about your situation while maintaining your respect for duty and protocol, that takes a kind of courage that few people possess. You've taught me something today about what real service means." The crowd of onlookers, both royal staff and tourists, began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal protocol typically maintained strict boundaries between the royal family and their security staff. But those boundaries were dissolving in the face of genuine human connection and understanding. "I've been queen consort for a relatively short time," Camilla continued, her voice growing more confident as she found her footing in this new emotional territory. "I've worked hard to understand my role and to uphold the traditions and dignity of the monarchy. But today you've reminded me that the most important tradition of all is caring for the people who serve us." James's composure finally began to crack slightly, his eyes showing the relief of someone who had been carrying a tremendous burden alone and was finally experiencing understanding instead of judgment. The other guards remained at their posts but were clearly moved by what they were witnessing. "No one should have to choose between their duty to their country and their love for their family," Camilla said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "And no one who serves this family should ever have to face such a crisis without our full support and understanding." The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting everything in a golden light that seemed to emphasize the significance of the moment. What had begun as a routine security matter had transformed into something much more profound, a moment of genuine human connection that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet imagine. What happened next would be talked about for years to come among palace staff, and would eventually make its way into the history books as an example of true leadership and compassion. Queen Camilla, without hesitation or consultation with advisors, made a decision that shocked everyone present. "James," she said with firm resolve, "I want you to go to your mother. Right now. Today." The words seemed to echo across the courtyard, and James stared at her in disbelief. The head of security stepped forward, clearly concerned about the security implications, but Camilla held up her hand to stop him before he could speak. "But Your Majesty," James stammered, "the security protocol's my duties. I can't just—" "You can, and you will," Camilla interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm not just suggesting it, James, I'm ordering it. As your queen consort, I'm giving you immediate, compassionate leave to be with your mother for as long as she needs you." The crowd of tourists and photographers could sense that they were witnessing something extraordinary, even if they couldn't hear every word. The image of the queen consort standing so close to a guard, speaking with such obvious emotion and care, was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Camilla turned to address the head of security directly. "I want you to arrange immediate transportation to Liverpool for Sergeant Morrison. Use whatever resources are necessary, and I want his pay to continue in full during his leave, with all benefits maintained." The head of security, a man who had worked in royal protection for over 20 years, nodded quickly. He had never seen such a direct and immediate intervention from a member of the royal family in a personnel matter. But the authority and compassion in Camilla's voice left no room for argument. "Furthermore," Camilla continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard so that all the guards could hear, "I want a full review of our compassionate leave policies. No one who serves this family should ever again have to choose between duty and being with a dying parent. We are better than that, and we will do better." James's fellow guards exchanged glances of amazement and respect. Not only was their colleague receiving the help he desperately needed, but their queen consort was ensuring that future guards would never face the same impossible choice. "Your Majesty," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to say. I never expected. I was prepared to accept whatever consequences." "The only consequence," Camilla said warmly, "is that you're going to get in a car and drive to Liverpool to be with your mother. You're going to hold her hand, tell her you love her, and stay with her for as long as she needs you. That's an order." For the first time since the conversation began, James smiled, a genuine, brilliant smile that transformed his entire face. Several of the watching guards felt tears in their own eyes as they witnessed their colleague's relief and gratitude. But Camilla wasn't finished. "I also want you to give me her hospital room number," she said, pulling out her personal phone. "I'd like to call her if she's up for it, to let her know that her son is on his way and to thank her personally for raising such an honorable man." This request sent another wave of shock through the assembled crowd. The idea of the Queen Consort personally calling a dying woman in a Liverpool hospital was so far outside normal protocol that even the most experienced royal staff were stunned. She would be honored. "Your Majesty," James said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion. "She's always been so proud of my service to the royal family. To receive a call from you would mean more to her than I could ever express." Camilla smiled warmly. "Then it's settled. And James, I want you to know that when you're ready to return to duty, your position will be waiting for you. But I also want you to know that there's no pressure to return quickly. Take all the time you need." The head of security approached cautiously. "Your Majesty, I can have a car ready in 15 minutes. Should I arrange for a security detail to accompany Sergeant Morrison?" "No," Camilla said immediately. "He's going as a son, not as a royal guard. He needs privacy and peace with his family. Just get him there safely and quickly." James stood there for a moment, seeming almost unable to believe that his nightmare was ending, and his greatest wish was about to be fulfilled. The weight that had been pressing down on him for weeks was lifting, replaced by hope and gratitude beyond measure. "Thank you," he said simply. But the two words carried more emotion and sincerity than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. "Thank you for understanding, for caring, and for giving me the chance to be with her." Camilla reached out and placed her hand briefly on James's arm, a gesture that broke every rule of royal protocol but perfectly captured the human moment they were sharing. "Go to your mother, James. Tell her that her son is a credit to her and to this country. And tell her that she has the gratitude of the royal family for raising such a remarkable young man." As James hurried toward the waiting car that had been arranged with extraordinary speed, the other guards maintained their positions but watched with obvious pride and emotion. They had witnessed something unprecedented, a moment when humanity and compassion had trumped protocol and bureaucracy, resulting in exactly the kind of outcome that restored faith in the institutions they served. As James's car disappeared into London traffic, Queen Camilla remained in the courtyard, her mind racing with thoughts about what had just transpired and what it meant for her understanding of leadership and compassion. The tourists and photographers were still present, their cameras having captured what they sensed was a historic moment, though the full significance wouldn't become clear until much later. Camilla turned to address the remaining guards, her voice carrying a warmth and sincerity that was entirely different from her tone at the beginning of the morning. "I owe all of you an apology," she began, looking each guard in the eye as she spoke. "I came here today with assumptions and criticisms that were completely unfounded. I failed to understand that what I interpreted as casual behavior was actually colleagues caring for one another during a crisis." The guards listened intently, many of them still processing the extraordinary events they had just witnessed. They had seen their queen consort transform before, their eyes from a stern authority figure into someone who demonstrated the kind of leadership and compassion they had only hoped to serve. I want you to know that the support you've been providing to James, the friendship, the understanding, the coverage when his grief became overwhelming, that represents the very best of what it means to serve together," Camilla continued. "You didn't abandon your duties. You expanded them to include caring for a colleague in crisis. That's not unprofessional behavior. That's exemplary behavior." The head of security, who had been quiet during most of the exchange, stepped forward slightly. "Your Majesty, if I may, we should have done more to communicate James's situation to the appropriate levels. The denial of his leave request was based on incomplete information and insufficient consideration of the human element." Camilla nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly why we're going to review and reform these policies.
No one should ever again have to suffer in silence while continuing to serve.
We need systems that recognize that taking care of our people is not a weakness or a distraction from security. It's essential to maintaining the kind of service we depend on." Meanwhile, James was making the journey north to Liverpool, his mind barely able to process the rapid change in his circumstances. The drive that should have taken several hours was being expedited through careful route planning and priority treatment. For the first time in weeks, he felt hope instead of despair, anticipation instead of dread. Back at the palace, Camilla was making the phone call she had promised. Standing in her private office, she dialed the hospital number James had provided, her heart racing slightly as she prepared to speak with a dying woman she had never met, but whose son had just taught her one of the most important lessons of her life. May I speak with Margaret Morrison?
Please?
Camilla asked when the hospital operator answered. This is Camilla, Queen Consort. I'd like to speak with her about her son James, if she's feeling up to a phone call. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by some hurried conversation in the background, as hospital staff tried to process this unprecedented request. Finally, a nurse came on the line to explain that Mrs. Morrison was awake and alert, though quite weak, and would be honored to speak with Her Majesty. When Margaret Morrison's voice came through the phone, it was frail but filled with warmth and curiosity. Your Majesty, is this really happening?
Is my James all right?
Camilla felt her throat tighten with emotion as she heard the concern in the dying woman's voice. Even in her final days, her primary worry was for her son's well-being. Mrs. Morrison, your James is more than all right. He's extraordinary. I'm calling to tell you that he's on his way to you right now, and to thank you personally for raising such an honorable and courageous young man. The conversation that followed would remain private between the two women, but those who saw Camilla afterward noted that she seemed changed by it, more grounded, more focused on what truly mattered in leadership and service. By the time James arrived at the hospital in Liverpool, word of the morning's events had begun to spread through social media and news outlets. The photographs and videos taken by tourists had gone viral, with people around the world sharing their amazement at witnessing what they described as real leadership and humanity in action. James found his mother propped up in her hospital bed, her face glowing with pride and excitement despite her obvious weakness. The Queen Consort called me, she whispered as he took her hand. She said the most beautiful things about you, and she made me feel like the proudest mother in England. For the first time in months, James felt complete peace. He was where he needed to be. His duty had been honored and his service had been recognized and valued by the very people he had sworn to protect. The impossible choice between love and duty had been resolved by a leader who understood that true strength comes from compassion, not rigid adherence to rules. The story of what happened in the palace courtyard that morning began to spread far beyond the initial witnesses. News outlets picked up the story, social media exploded with praise for Camilla's response, and people around the world shared their own stories of times when compassion had triumphed over bureaucracy. But perhaps most importantly, the other guards at Buckingham Palace noticed a change in how they were treated and valued. The promised policy review was swift and comprehensive, resulting in new guidelines that prioritized the human needs of those who served, while maintaining the security standards that were essential to their mission. 3 weeks later, James sat beside his mother's bed holding her hand as she peacefully passed away in her sleep. The extra time he had been given with her, thanks to Queen Camilla's intervention, had allowed them to share precious final conversations, resolve old conflicts, and express the deep love they felt for each other. Margaret Morrison died knowing that her son's service was valued and respected at the highest levels, and James was able to be present for her final breath instead of standing guard hundreds of miles away. The funeral was a small, private affair in Liverpool, but it was marked by an extraordinary gesture that would be remembered by the Morrison family for generations. Queen Camilla sent a personal wreath with a handwritten note that read, "In honor of Margaret Morrison, whose son's courage and dedication exemplify the very best of service to the crown. Her legacy lives on in the remarkable man she raised." Even more surprising was the arrival of several of James's fellow guards, who had been given permission to attend the service. They had driven up from London in their personal vehicles, wanting to support their colleague during his time of grief and to pay their respects to the woman who had raised one of the finest men they had ever served alongside. The head of security at Buckingham Palace had also implemented the comprehensive policy review that Queen Camilla had demanded. The new guidelines, which became known informally as the Margaret Morrison Protocols, ensured that compassionate leave would be granted immediately in cases of terminal illness or family crisis, with full pay and benefits maintained. Emergency support systems were established to provide temporary coverage without compromising security, and regular check-ins were instituted to monitor the well-being of all security personnel. When James returned to duty 6 weeks later, he found a transformed workplace. The rigid hierarchy that had previously made it difficult for guards to communicate personal struggles had been replaced with a more supportive structure that encouraged openness and mutual assistance. Counseling services had been made available, and supervisors had been trained to recognize signs of personal distress among their team members. But perhaps the most significant change was in Queen Camilla herself. The incident had profoundly affected her understanding of leadership and her role within the royal family. She began making regular informal visits to different departments within the palace, taking time to speak personally with staff members and learn about their lives beyond their professional duties. The story of that morning in the courtyard had spread far beyond the palace walls, becoming an international symbol of compassionate leadership. News articles were written about it, leadership seminars used it as a case study, and countless people shared how the story had inspired them to look more carefully at the human cost of their own decisions and policies. James himself became something of a reluctant celebrity within royal protection circles. Other security services began reaching out to learn about the supportive culture that had developed at Buckingham Palace, and James was often asked to speak about the importance of balancing duty with humanity. He always credited Queen Camilla's courage in that moment for creating the change that benefited everyone. The relationship between James and Queen Camilla evolved into one of mutual respect and understanding that transcended the traditional boundaries between royalty and staff. While maintaining appropriate professional protocols, there was an underlying warmth and recognition that came from having shared a moment of profound honesty and compassion. 6 months after his mother's death, James received a personal invitation to attend a small private ceremony in Queen Camilla's study. There, in the presence of the head of security and a few senior staff members, she presented him with a special commendation for extraordinary service and personal courage in the face of adversity. "James," she said as she handed him the certificate, "your mother would be proud not just of this recognition, but of the positive changes that have come from your willingness to speak honestly about your situation. You've made life better for everyone who serves this family, and that's a legacy that honors her memory." The ceremony was followed by tea and conversation, during which James shared stories about his mother and her reaction to Queen Camilla's phone call. She said it was the highlight of her life, he told her. She felt like she had contributed something important to the monarchy, even though she never wore a uniform or carried a title. "She did contribute something important," Camilla replied. "She raised a son who reminded me what true service looks like. That's a contribution that will benefit this institution for years to come." The changes implemented at Buckingham Palace began to spread to other royal residences and government security services. The Margaret Morrison protocols became a model for organizations around the world that were seeking to balance operational requirements with human compassion. Leadership conferences began featuring presentations on the Camilla model, focusing on how authentic care for subordinates could actually strengthen rather than weaken institutional effectiveness, while James continued his service with renewed dedication and purpose, knowing that his work had meaning beyond just protection and protocol. He became a mentor to new guards, helping them understand that strength and vulnerability could coexist, and that the best service came from people who felt valued and supported rather than feared and constrained. 1 year after that transformative morning in the palace courtyard, Queen Camilla established an annual award in Margaret Morrison's honor. The Margaret Morrison Award for Compassionate Service would be given each year to a member of the royal household staff who demonstrated exceptional care for their colleagues while maintaining the highest standards of professional excellence. James was chosen to present the first award, and as he stood before the assembled palace staff in the state dining room, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The scared, grief-stricken young man who had been desperately trying to balance duty and love had become a confident leader who helped others navigate their own challenges. "My mother always told me that the measure of a person isn't how they act when everything is easy," James said as he addressed the group. "It's how they respond when faced with impossible choices and overwhelming pain." Queen Camilla showed us that day that true leadership isn't about enforcing rules and maintaining distance. It's about seeing the humanity in the people who serve you and responding with courage and compassion. The recipient of the first award was a member of the kitchen staff who had been quietly organizing support for colleagues facing financial hardship, creating an informal network of assistance that had helped dozens of families through difficult times. As Camilla presented the award, she noted that the recipient embodied the same spirit of service that had made Margaret Morrison, so proud of her son, the changes that began with a single moment of honest conversation had rippled outward in ways that none of them could have initially imagined. Palace staff reported higher job satisfaction, lower turnover, and improved performance across all departments. The security team, in particular, had developed a reputation as one of the most effective and cohesive protective units in the world, largely because they functioned as a supportive family rather than just a collection of individual guards. International media continued to follow the story, often using it as an example of how institutions could evolve and improve without losing their essential character or effectiveness. Leadership experts pointed to Queen Camilla's response as a masterclass in crisis management, showing how a moment of potential embarrassment had been transformed into an opportunity for meaningful growth and positive change. James had been promoted to a senior position within the security team, where he was responsible for training new guards and overseeing the implementation of the supportive policies that had grown out of his experience. He approached his work with a combination of professional excellence and personal warmth that made him both respected and beloved by his colleagues. The tourists who had witnessed that original confrontation often shared their stories online, describing how they had expected to see a typical royal scolding, but instead witnessed something that restored their faith in human decency. Many of them had become devoted followers of the royal family, specifically because of what they had seen that day, feeling that they had glimpsed the genuine character behind the ceremonial roles. Queen Camilla's own public standing had been significantly enhanced by the incident and its aftermath. People around the world saw her not just as a member of the royal family, but as a leader who could admit mistakes, show genuine emotion, and make difficult decisions based on compassion rather than convenience. Her approval ratings had risen dramatically, but more importantly, she had found a deeper sense of purpose and authenticity in her role. The palace courtyard where everything had begun was no longer just a place where guards stood their posts and tourists took photos. It had become a symbol of transformation and hope, a reminder that even the most established institutions could change for the better when led by people who valued humanity over hierarchy. As James concluded his remarks at the award ceremony, he looked directly at Queen Camilla and said, "Your Majesty, you gave me the gift of time with my mother in her final weeks, but you gave all of us something even more valuable. You showed us that we don't have to choose between excellence and compassion, between duty and humanity. You taught us that the strongest institutions are built on understanding and care, not fear and rigid rules." The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged, but Camilla was most moved by the expressions on the faces of the staff members present. She could see pride, gratitude, and genuine affection, and she knew that this was what real leadership looked like. Not the ability to command through authority, but the wisdom to inspire through example. Later that evening, as James walked his familiar patrol route around the palace grounds, he thought about his mother and the conversation they had shared just days before her death. She had told him that she was proud not just of his service to the crown, but of his courage in speaking honestly about his struggles. "You helped create something better," she had whispered. "That's the best kind of legacy anyone can leave." The story that had begun with grief and misunderstanding had evolved into something beautiful and lasting. The young guard who had been afraid to speak up had found his voice and used it to create positive change. The queen consort who had come to enforce discipline had discovered the true meaning of compassionate leadership. And a dying woman's love for her son had become the catalyst for reforms that would benefit countless others. In the end, it wasn't the titles or ceremonies or protocols that mattered most. It was the simple human truth that Margaret Morrison had taught her son, and that he had shared with his queen. Real strength comes from caring for others, and the greatest service comes from understanding that everyone, regardless of rank or position, deserves to be treated with dignity and compassion.